Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi. Finally, we meet, Anam.
Yes, I know. It's so good to see you.
Okay, so one
Masuma?
quick question. Can I call you Khushi?
Yes, you can call me Khushi. Khushi Kabir if you want to be formal. Khushi is okay. Khushi Appa is okay. Everything is okay.
Okay. So we know all about you. Hello.
Oh,
And
hello.
your bio said that you are from a convent in Karachi. Can I ask which convent?
St. Joseph's. Yeah, the three sisters used to terrify us by saying this. You know, remember in front of the cathedral, there's that huge statue, that white marble statue.
Yes.
So there are two rooms behind it. There are two doors on either
Yes.
side.
Yes.
And one was hell and one was heaven. And they would tell us that if you were bad, we're going to put you into the room that is hell.
Trust the sisters.
Yeah, but I spent about 12 years of my life in Karachi. So my whole secondary schooling was in Karachi.
Oh,
and
great.
then my father went off to, well, he was posted to Islamabad. It was just beginning, but Islamabad had not yet been built fully. And there were no schools, colleges. So they stayed in Pindi. But I decided to come to Dhaka to study art.
So how I came into this is because I went to Manchester Birmingham last year, and I found that the Bangladeshis weren't very friendly to us, and that's when I started actually going into the history of Bangladesh, and my work changed completely. I shared it with Anam,
Right.
and I started researching, and so now it's all about Bangladesh and
Oh, wow.
Pakistan. It's
We
about
should-
71.
Anam, let me ask you one question. So when we talk about like Bangladesh, and I know you've been here once, but what is the first thing that like sort of comes to your mind, like when you think about Bangladesh?
Yeah, I think the first kind of images that come to me are food, art, cricket, culture. But then, as you said, because I've been there, Dhaka, comes to mind very, very quickly. And also because of the research, 1947, 1971, silence comes to mind. Silences that I grew up with, around 24 years of history, prior to Bangladesh's birth. And then, of course, the people that opened their homes to me in Bangladesh, trusted me with their stories. So when I think of Bangladesh, I see all of them. And I think of their hospitality and warmth. Their stories.
What memories do you have of Karachi or Pakistan?
My memories, it's a good question, and it's a question that will get me thinking here, because my memories of me growing up in Karachi were very pleasant memories. I went to a school which was an English medium school, so we spoke English in school with all my friends and in school itself. But at home, we stayed, my father was with the government. So we stayed in one of those government colonies. And there was quite a large group of Bengalis who were also central government officers who lived in that colony. And I think because as the Bengali girls were much more open, we used to play, come afternoon, we had to be going out and playing. So we used to play with the boys and we used to play. Whereas most of the non-Bengali girls they were sort of kept more at home and not, they weren't as, at least when we were growing up and in the area we grew up in, they were more, not the ones that were playing all the time. We were playing cricket, baseball, climbing trees, biking. We used to, for 6 annas, you would get the bike for 2 hours and you'd ride around everywhere. So we had all this great freedom. So all my friends at home were Bengalis. And the Bengali community was very strong and strongly knit. So we used to have a lot of, singing and, talking about our Bengali culture and dancing, singing, learning everything, trying to learn literature. My mother trying very hard to get us to read Bangla and Bangla books. So we grew up in a very Bengali cultured atmosphere at home. And also I think because we were outside of Dhaka and outside of relations and pressure, it was a much freer atmosphere. So we could wear what we wished. And Karachi was so safe then, because when I went to Karachi much later and people said you don't travel out on your own and all that, because it's there can be bombs and there can be attacks or something. And I said, this is not the Karachi I know, because the Karachi I knew was, I used to go everywhere. So I had a very pleasant childhood growing up in Karachi. But once I left Karachi and came to Dhaka, and my only visits would be to Pindi rather than to Karachi at all, So it was only Pindi because my father was posted in Islamabad and we were living in Pindi. So that was holidays. Mm-hmm. And then, the movement for Bangladesh, the Liberation War, everything. I was thinking back and I thought I didn't have any regrets about not having any connections or anything with Pakistan anymore. Now, many years later, it was actually a feminist workshop which I was in, and there were Pakistanis there. And for the first time, I had met Pakistanis. This was 83. And then again, 86. So I had met Pakistanis for the first time, and we were going to spend 6 weeks together, 4 weeks together. And I first broke down. And I think that broke down my, rejection and everything about Pakistan. And a friend of mine, I don't know if others know her, Nigat Said Khan Bani. She was someone who's a strong feminist activist. So she invited me to a workshop in a lovely place called Pitsha. And I think that was the best place to go to sort of come to terms with Pakistan is not the military. Pakistan is not only the military who came in 71 and a thing. There are a lot of other Pakistanis. So that's how I came to terms and became friends with and had good friends with Pakistan. So that initial years after 71, especially after 71, and that complete shutting out ended then. So yeah, childhood was wonderful. I think Karachi was a lovely city because it was very cosmopolitan. Mm-hmm. I don't know what it's like now, but it was very, very cosmopolitan.
It's dangerous now, very dangerous, but yet it is still very cosmopolitan. There are still traces of the life we used to live before. And I say that because I've seen a bit of that Karachi also. I've just mostly heard about it and seen it in my parents' photographs, but yeah, I've been through that also. And that it still is a lovely place. I'd rather be nowhere else, really. But it's very edgy now. Anything can happen at any time.
I know, because when I went there and I wanted to go to the places to school, to the house I lived in, etc. And just that day there was some bomb attack in a car or something like that, and they said, no, you're not going to that side at all. And I said, this is not the Karachi I knew. And they,
You hear that from Khushi Appa, and that's exactly when you've done a lot of research for your work. So what does come to your mind in terms of, what do you try to bring through your work around 71 to the community in Bangladesh and Pakistan and also South Asia in general? Like, what do you feel you contribute personally through your work?
I think the work really began, it's been very much a personal journey for me because I realized, I was working on 1947, I was working in India and Pakistan, and that got me thinking much more about 71. And it was always something that was so brushed under the carpet, in my textbooks, for instance, 24 years of history, 9 months of bloody war are just kind of summed up within a few paragraphs, and that's it, we don't talk about it. In my textbooks, right? In my school textbooks, kind of growing up, it was just never spoken about. And when it would be talked about, it was always vis-a-vis India. So it was always kind of registered and projected as this, Indo-Pak war, as this another kind of bilateral conflict in the region. And I knew so little. And so I started thinking about it more, and I knew from my work on partition that India and Pakistan have a very different understanding of partition. 47 is not a static event that's looked at similarly on both sides of the border. So I started thinking, okay, 71 is seen as this, Indo-Pak war, or as this loss. How is it perceived in Bangladesh? And when I went back to some of the texts, there was so much silence, right? And I knew so little about people who Pakistan had shared so much history with. I knew so little about that year. So for me, my work on 71s very much just became this kind of personal quest, this curiosity. I wanted to go to Bangladesh. I wanted to hear the stories. I wanted to look at how 71 is memorialized and remembered, both at, through textbooks and museums, but at a people's level. What are people's memories of it? And kind of look at that in comparison to the forgetting, to the silencing in Pakistan. Because I think it is so important, I was born in 88, and we are losing the generations that, like Khushi Appa, may have lived on the other side, or may have had friends or went to school in one place or the other and have these other memories, these other kind of stories. And all we're left with are these distortions. I'm talking very specifically about Pakistan, the distortions that I grew up with, the silences, the censoring, the butchering of history. So for me, it became very important to kind of access these narratives for my own learning. And I hope that through my work, I've been able to record some of those stories for future generations as well, for them to be able to access history in a more nuanced way, moving beyond simplistic binaries that state histories draw, and really understand what 71 meant at a people's level, what people went through. And I know that, you were talking about your experience at Khushi Appa in the 80s with the feminist groups. And I know in the 90s as well, there was, I think one of the only efforts towards a proper apology have been by women who dedicated this day. Right. And then there's very little, I mean, so there are those narratives as well, I think, that need to be recorded, that Pakistanis need to know about. And through this book, I was able to access, Pakistani poets, Pakistani academics, intellectuals, artists who had actually protested in 71 against military action, who continue to do that work. And I knew so little about those Pakistanis, and I knew nothing about Bangladeshis. So I'm hoping that, through the book, through some of the work that I've done, it's just a starting point. It's very, it's a very humble effort. But I hope that it sparks curiosity. It gives us a different lens into each other. When I came to Bangladesh, for most Bangladeshis, I was the first Pakistani they met. And so as you were speaking, there was this barrier, and there were so many emotions that came up because we were talking about 71 and they had never met a Pakistani. So I think there needs to be this effort where we are having more dialogue, where we are having these conversations, and where we are moving beyond textbook history, because that is not telling us anything. So I hope I've been able to just start that process in some small way. And that other Pakistanis, read these stories and then, are curious and they look beyond the silences.
Your book really put things in order for me. So thank you for that. But where you say silence, after reading your book, it is when I started asking people what they had been through. And I think it's very important to really go ask people what. I had never asked my chacha what he went through in 71 in Dhaka. And that's, I started asking him, and my papa, and I've started collecting these narratives now. And they make so much sense. And I see both sides of the story.
I think 71 changed a lot of us who were young then, because that war, it was a war that affected anybody who lived here. And I don't think there is any Bengali family who has not lost someone during that war. It was a very traumatic war. For 9 months, someone like me who could never stay at home had to stay at home, be home, etc. And so it was a totally different thing. And there was a lot of feeling of we are going to win. We are going to win someday. We didn't know when, but we just felt that there was no way that we are not going to win. So that feeling of positiveness was behind in our mind, even though every other day we'd hear of somebody we knew being killed or someone being captured, our friends having joined the liberation war and fighting and going to the other side. So after 71, in beginning of 72, there were some efforts at trying to do rehabilitation work. And I joined one of these Bangladeshi NGOs. They were working with the refugee camps. There were about 10 million people who had moved to West India, Tripura, Assam, and West Bengal, and staying in really terrible conditions in the camps. So there were people who were doing relief work in terms of food and medicines, etc. And so when some of them came back and they wanted to, we found that people came back to villages that were completely razed to the ground. So no homes, no plows, no boats, no nothing, no crops. So a lot of relief and rehabilitation work had to be done. And I joined one of these groups, which was working in a very remote area. So after working for a year or so, I decided to go through this dilemma of thinking, do I go back to doing a master's? Because by then Chittagong University had opened a master's department in fine arts. So do I go for a master's in fine art? And then I thought I need to go and see the village the villages. It was about 200 villages in one location that this organization I was with was working. So I wanted to go and stay there and see it before I make up my mind, because here I was in Dhaka doing all the reports, writing all the proposals, coordinating with other agencies and with the government and other things, general work, and the reports from the field and sending things that were needed. So when I was decided to go, of course, the director of the organization was very, saying that, how can you go to this village and go there and see it? There's no place for you to stay. I said, I don't mind staying with the guys. It's all right. They may have problems. I don't. There's no separate toilet. I said, that's never been a problem for me. So I pushed myself to go there. And I said I'd go and stay there. And they said, supposing the villagers don't, accept you. I said, I come back. I said, what if you can't accept being, because there's no electricity, there's no water, there's no roads, there's, had to walk miles during winter or take a country boat. There was no much, motorized boats in those days. So it was quite rough, but I loved it. And I went there, and I think people had no problems with me. I had no problems with them. I think people just look at people and see if they're genuine or not. So when I went there and I saw for myself, and I told you before, my father was in the government, so I'd seen a different side of society. Of course, I saw the movement, the students' movement, I've seen the liberation war movement. But, the way governments behave with people in the villages, in the rural areas, with women, with poor, and especially if they're from, like the area I worked in had a large Hindu population too, which is why most of the villages were razed to the ground. And there were many widows, young widows, a lot of men were killed. So when I went there, I realized that, the government services never reach them, and it's all very exploitative. They treat them not like human beings. And I felt that I had to stay there. By the time I had read books like Frantz Fanon and Ivan Illich and Pedagogy of the Oppressed with Paulo Freire. So I had all these ideas in my mind. So I went and I decided to get myself transferred and live in the village. So I spent about a huge, large portion is about, say, from 73 or 4 onwards till 80, I was more or less based in the village, except for a year where I did a course. So I stayed in these villages that were very remote and very, it was absolutely, and, you really had no bathrooms, no nothing. You used to have to bathe in the open ponds, etc. So I just, I think people accepted me because, now the reason I say so, even children of people who's, in the areas, in the villages I worked with, they come and they find me out and they say, I've heard about you from my father, I wanted to see you, etc., which is very sweet. But they must have had many people who go there. But I spent 4 or 5 years in this one area, and people remember me a lot. I remember them a lot. So for me, I don't think, the lack of facilities or lifestyle was an issue at all. Maybe the 1971 war, of having been enclosed in one house throughout 9 months, may have shown me that, one can do anything. So when I went there, I felt that this is more meaningful, and this is something that I could do, because most people would not. And I would really, because maybe I was more privileged, I could just go up to the government officers and the police concerned and really shout at them and tell them that, this is what is happening, and we don't expect this to happen. Whereas many others would feel more intimidated in doing this kind of thing. So I felt I could be a voice and be with them. And at the same time, I learned so much from being with the people I'm working with, staying with, living with. They shared their lives with me. I heard a lot about what they were doing. I think I learned a lot. I learned so much more than I learned from books and from talking to people in Dhaka city about, society structures, about exploitation. I just saw it firsthand and experienced it. So I felt this was more meaningful. It's not that I don't love art. I love art, but art is, you're self-expressing what you're thinking. And what I'm doing now is just bringing and helping people have their own voices, their own agency, and to be citizens of this country, and be citizens with dignity and equality in every way. So there was no turning back. I mean, that's what changed me. Yeah. But I didn't think that not having the kind of food I was used to, not having the kind of lifestyle I was used to was an issue at all. It didn't bother me at all, having to carry my own bags and walk, and then wash my own clothes and bathe in the pond. Learning to, I thought I was very proud of the fact the day I could change from a wet sari to a dry sari without showing an inch of skin in a public pond. And I thought, oh, I've mastered it, yeah.
What you both really have in common, what we thought why you both match, is as you work on various levels of education, religion, culture, class, so, and we're just sort of trying to dive deeper into the understanding of how people form narratives about a certain, what Khushi Appa just said, people in the city form a certain narrative about the people on the countryside. That's what they think, that's what they do, that's how they structure that's how their society is structured. And so could you share with us how you personally talk to people or interview people for your book or for your work who have a different, or almost let's say a diverging standpoint from yours? It could be in political or religious or any way, also historical way. If you talk to someone and they're the textbook person and you just try to get something out. So, how's your approach? How do you talk to people? And
Yeah. Well, firstly, I'm just so inspired listening to Khushi Appa right now, and I don't know what I can say about my work after that. But I think where I'd really agree is, I don't think you can really learn. I mean, for me particularly, it's been so important to be in the field. The kind of learning you get from books, it's phenomenal, of course, but it's very different than being out there with people, in their homes and interviewing them, where they live and so forth. So the fieldwork has been very important. And I think of my own privilege when I go on, of course. I think a lot about, I write in English, and that in itself provides this kind of safety, because I know that if I was writing in vernacular, and I know people who do write in regional languages who firstly don't get the same kind of outreach for their work, especially internationally, but even, within mainstream cities of Pakistan. Like when I was working in Kashmir, there's so many writers writing in regional languages, and you don't even get that literature in Islamabad. So I think a lot about that. And I think also about the kind of the challenges they have to face, right? Writing about the issues that they are dealing with on a day-to-day basis in their regional languages. So just how does my privilege, when you talk about class or, education, how does my privilege allow me to tell these stories? But that doesn't mean I'm the first person telling them. That doesn't mean that people are not doing incredible work, right? So it's only when you go out there that you can break these stereotypes that you have of people in rural areas or people in a particular region of Pakistan. You need to be there to see the incredible things that are happening on ground, how people have indigenous forms of healing, how people have indigenous forms of responding. A lot of my work in Kashmir, for instance, has been with women on the line of control. So what does, when I come from a city like Islamabad or Lahore, I'm so far away from really the conflict that we read about in the news all the time. But what does it mean to live on the line of control? Right? What does it mean to live caught between Indian and Pakistani army posts with cross-border shelling? And how do women kind of experience that is very different, because men will often move to the cities and women are kind of left behind. So just recording these women's stories, so different from my experience, right? But the kind of resilience, the kind of, because they come together and they organize these protests, and the women protests, for asking for peace, and they've been so successful in so many ways. So just, I think for me, it's so much learning every time I go out in the field, whether I'm working in a particular region or, for instance, if I'm interviewing the Hindu community in Pakistan, those are, again, parts of my history, parts of my culture that we have been so disconnected from, that we have otherized. So my approach is, I often don't have a question here. I have a general sense of what I want to know, but I go in there and I always learn because I have all these perceptions and conceptions of what's going to happen in that setting, and I'm always proved wrong. So I've learned now that I go in with this listening here, and I know that I have my own kind of unlearning process that I need to go through. And to answer, that specific question about when somebody has a different, like, conventional story, a textbook kind of understanding, that's hard, because I also do work as a counselor. So sometimes you come across stories where people have a very different value system, very different ideological viewpoint than you do. And in those circumstances, I do think of power. I do think of power dynamics. So let's say if I'm interviewing somebody at the state level, for instance, who has had a lot of power and has been involved in certain kind of policy making, that's also my opportunity to push and to challenge and to ask questions, right? Very different than if I'm working with women on the line of control. So my kind of position in reference to who I'm sitting with, changes the kind of questions or the approach that I would take. But at the heart of it is this need to, is this position of learning, is this, tuning into to what is being said, both verbally, but also through the body language, through the silences, through what is not being said. So.
Can I say something? Yeah, I just was listening to you, Anam, and I was thinking, I just find so much similarities in the way I feel also, and what you were saying. I think we go through the same processes all the time. Like, I feel that it's basically, if you are genuine, people realize that you are genuine, and if you really want to know and learn, and not somebody who's gone with a preconceived idea and a position that this is what it is, and I'm just going to get answers to reconfirm what I've already decided is what it is. Then that is, that's the same thing that I find also still now. And again, with talking with people from different sides, like you're talking with in the LOC with the women there, and then you're talking with people in power positions. And I find the same, that I have the ability to be able to talk at both levels. I can talk at both levels, and I can, my language will be different with somebody who's in a position of power than my language would be with somebody who's an absolute, say, an indigenous, non-Muslim person, woman from one of the most, one of the most marginalized, and the ones who are most, the ones who are never brought into the, who are forgotten or not even taken cognizance of. So then my language is different. Everything, my body language, the way I speak. So, and I was hearing you, I was saying, oh, that's, I was resonating with it so much that I find it's very similar.
I'd like to know something from both of you. There are always these life-changing moments or moments that change your thinking, really, as I told you, happened to me in Birmingham. But what is what is that moment that defined how your thinking changed?
So who wants to go first?
Khushi.
Okay. So 71 for me was a turning point. There was no question about that, because that's what made me go into the kind of work I am. I think going and living in the village, which was a totally new experience for me, and it was, let me just describe a bit, like the place I went to work in first. You had to take an overnight train, and then you stopped somewhere, and then you took a 2-hour bus ride till you came to a place where the motor launches would leave between 8 to 12 noon. So you had to, if your train was late, there's no place to stay in that place, and there was no way you could get to the village you were going to go to. So between 8 and 12, so you took the overnight train, then you took the bus, so you could reach there in the morning and catch the, what we call launches, motorized boats. And there, of course, there was this thing like the women's room was separate. And it was a tiny little room where the children, women, goats, chicken, everything were all squashed in one room. And the men had a much larger room with windows, etc. I always sat in the men's room, and I said, and they would say, no, go and sit there. I said, no, I don't want to sit there, because that's very, why didn't you have enough equal spaces made for both? So then, and I don't have any problem sitting here. And if the men have problems with me sitting here, then men can leave. I'm not leaving. So, so I really started seeing everywhere the whole difference in way people perceived women in every place. They looked at me as being different, so they accepted certain behavior from me that they would not have accepted from women from their own community. So it would take a 6-hour launch ride to the first stop where we would get down. And from there, the village I worked in, it would take a 4-hour ride on a country boat. Or in winter, you had to walk, because this is an area that used to get inundated for 7 months of the year, or 8 months, or 7 months of the year. So you took a boat ride, and we didn't have engine boats then. We just had those sailboats. And it would take 4 hours. And when you walked in winter, it was a 10-mile walk. And there was no roads. So, and many times, of course, I fell, and all kinds of funny stories, but life was fun, and that's part of life. So for me, going there, that means I went and I lived there. Coming back is not so easy. It meant making a lot of plans before being able to come. I just loved meeting with people. I just loved being with people. I just loved talking and learning and understanding. I had an idea that Hindu women were much freer than Muslim women. And I found that the very traditional Hindu community has very strict and rules for women, and those are all very oppressive. So I found that its oppression does not only exist within the Muslim community, it exists everywhere. So started learning a lot more about how religion is oppressive and it's patriarchal, learning about how roles within the household were, so divisive, and so, it was so controlling. So for me, it was, I was just lapping up everything and learning everything. For me, it was even like there were snakes used to come into the room, and that didn't scare me. And I said, okay, getting onto the boat, if there was a storm, because it was almost like a sea, the whole area gets inundated. It was beautiful, visually beautiful. I think my 5 years of the art college helped me a lot in appreciating the beauty and everything that was around me. And I never got bored. So, I never got bored of talking to people and seeing their faces and expression, never got bored of the countryside, never got bored of the landscape, never got bored of being. in the boat. And because I didn't know how to swim at all, not even float, so I wasn't scared, because if I drown in a absolutely calm water, I'm drowning. If it's a storm, I'm drowning. Whereas if there was a storm, everybody else would get really panicky. And I was quite cool about it. And they said, why are you cool? I said, I drown anyway, so it doesn't matter. So who cares? So I'd sing and try and make everyone feel slightly more comfortable. I just thought everything was great fun and a challenge. It was so beautiful. Like at night, suddenly I'd hear singing and dancing, because there was a wedding going to be somewhere and something. Weddings were not flashy thing, but it was just the group of women sitting and singing and dancing. I'd take the boat and just row across and go to that village and join them, and I loved it. And I think, like I felt really safe. And although later on I had a lot of women, not a lot, 8 women, who we then recruited and asked to work with us. And because I was there, they felt more comfortable. So at night we used to work with the men. And I found that there was this added advantage of being a woman, that the woman would open up totally to us. But the men also accepted us, because we were not women from their community. So they didn't expect us to have the same. So they treated us like almost a man kind of a thing. And of course, we had to do things like when we walked fast, because we wanted to reach that place fast. So they thought that here are people who are different. But we were very secure, very, very secure. Even there were certain little villages which were known as dacoit villages, where they used to go. The occupation of all the people in that village was, going in. But they would, we'd hear this noise of the boat going past, and we say, who's it? And they say, you keep quiet. We are not coming to you. So we knew that they were the dacoits. So they would leave us alone, they would never come. They would never not find anything, but they wouldn't come. But I think for me, it was basically so much of learning. And then later on, I started working in other parts of Bangladesh, where I started working with indigenous communities, and then finding out how they were exploited, especially the women from the indigenous communities, because they're of a different religion, they're of a different ethnicity, everything. So all kinds of the different, what we are now talking about, intersectionalities and all that. In those times, those words were not there. But I could see that the differences that existed even amongst women who were economically maybe of the same level, but because of being a Muslim woman, she was more privileged than an Hindu woman, or more privileged, the Hindu woman was more privileged than an indigenous woman who lived in the absolute very remote areas. So all those differences came out. And also, as I said, I worked a lot with men too. And the men accepted us. Men accepted me, or women like me, as being somebody who they could talk to as an equal and talk to. So I had this added advantage, I felt, of being able to talk to both the men and women, and which the men who worked with me were not able to be as close with the women. The women would not open up about their own personal lives, the sexual exploitation they face from other members of the male members of their family. So all those things, there were many little things. So many, details I learned about, which also about 1971. I had as Anam was saying, the narrative, or you were talking also of the narrative that was given about 71. We also had a narrative about 71. Mm-hmm. And that narrative did not include indigenous communities. That narrative did not include many things within that, the differences that existed. So I think, especially after 75, when they tried to change the narrative and bring back the Muslim, the Muslim identity, or the Bengali Muslim identity is being what being in Bangladesh is. So that was a distortion of history. And so we were trying to fight that. And to fight that, we wanted to really bring in and look at what subaltern history was really about, and what people, and especially women's voices within that, was going to be about. So that is something, and I think here I'll link it with, because of all the work we did, and then I started getting a bit more known. So everybody started coming to me. A lot of people started coming to me who were not who I was not working with, but because they needed support. There was violence, there was murder, there was something, and they would come and think that I would be able to help. And so I reached out, and we became a much larger group. But I felt for my own self, I needed to go back and be friends and close again with all my artist colleagues. I think they gave me a kind of a route and a place where I could think more clearly and much more, it's you're not closed in and forced to be part of a rigid narrative that is being given. So for me, that is very important, that having that linkage and with art and culture. And I think, some of the, like when I'm with Britto has been to many of the rural areas we've worked with and worked with local artisans there. So we've helped, link them up. And so the artisans also participated in creating new kinds of artwork too, apart from what they do for the general. It opens up the idea, and it opened up, I do think it's very important that if we all work in only one sector and one place, we tend to get very narrow, and we don't see beyond that. So it's really important that you widen it much more and let people open up their minds and become much more creative and learn to be more creative and learn to see much more. You learn much more. I think every day you learn so much that's new from everyone. That's so important.
So Anam, at such a young age, you've kind of written about Kashmir, and then you've written about 1971. So what was your life-changing experience? There are so many for you also.
Yeah.
I think for me, it started off, I can actually remember the moment, it was this interview I was doing in Sahiwal. I was working with the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, which is this non-profit organization. And I was heading the oral history program in Lahore. So we had gone out there, my team and I, to conduct this interview. And there was this elderly man who we were supposed to talk about like early years of Pakistan and so forth. And he just mentioned going back to India. And he mentioned, being at Wagah border and the kind of interaction he had over there, the way he was received. So when he opened his passport, it said born in Amritsar. And, when the officials saw that at the customs counter, they looked and said, "This Sada Banda hai, he's one of us." And he didn't understand because he had kind of, blocked off that part of his history. He had left at a very young age, left his home locked, thinking he'll go back, never could, and had moved, and then Pakistan was created and so forth. And so he talked about this encounter, and then he said something happened to me in that moment. And I realized, how much I had on the other side, just standing on that land, smelling the air, touching the mitti, and he told me about his journey. And that really triggered something in me because I had grown up in a Pakistan where, to be nostalgic or the idea of even longing for the other side, for me, would be seen as something unpatriotic, right? Why would you not? Because partition in Pakistan, you have to realize, it has a certain image, it has a certain connotation. It's linked very much to nation making. It's linked to this sense of triumph and victory alongside the bloodshed. So I had never really understood, this sense of nostalgia or longing. And I think that for many people, sometimes it is not even expressed because it can be construed as being disloyal to the idea of the nation state. But that triggered, so I said, okay, here's this person who wants to go back, and here am I, third generation Pakistani, and many that I know, because I work in schools as well, who have these biases, who have this prejudice, who never want to go across, who demonize the other. And that set me on this journey. So I decided, to actually identify people who had been across the border, who had homes across, who longed to go. And that's how the first book came about. It became this intergenerational work. So I interviewed people across 4 generations of India and Pakistan to look at how the memory of partition and the meaning of partition was changing and evolving. And there's been so much learning since then. I think that was just the starting point. Many of the things that Khushi Appa was just mentioning about the gendered ways of interviewing, the gendered ways of storytelling. Many times, I would sit with partition survivors and women would say, "We have seen nothing. We don't know. Why don't you speak to our husband? Why don't you speak to our brother?" And, there's that made me realize how women's experiences have often been so silenced because they're linked with notions of quote unquote honor and shame, right? So there's this internalized sense sometimes of being bystanders, but you sit there long enough, and then you see the kind of stories out there, and sometimes those stories don't come out in words. Sometimes they come out in silences. Sometimes they come out in the pauses and through the body language. So I've learned so much about the gendered experiences of conflict and, the ways that women versus men respond. A lot of times men will overtake that conversation as well. So you'll be doing an interview and suddenly, a male would come in from the family and they hijack that moment. So I've learned over time of how to also push and, navigate those tricky terrains. And it was just the work on partition, which then took me to Kashmir, because I realized, I'm looking at Punjab and partition in Punjab, and I can't understand partition unless I understand Kashmir, because that's where the ongoing manifestations of partition are felt on an everyday basis. I went to Kashmir, I did this work, and while I was there, I understood that I could not understand Kashmir till I understand 71, because I think we don't realize in Pakistan, but 71 is one of the most defining events. It has defined everything since. Our textbooks were revised afterwards. Our nuclear program was launched after that. The way we see ourselves, the way we see India, the way we see Bangladesh, the way we otherize is very much, it comes from 1971. So Kashmir took me there. And let's see where I go next. But it's all kind of, it got spurred by that one interview with this man who made me question my own notions of patriotism. Why does it have to be based on hostility of the other? What am I learning through my textbooks? And there are these, at the same time, Pakistan is very fortunate. We have our first generation still around, walking, talking sources of history, and the experiences are so much more nuanced and different. So there's violence, but there are also stories of having friends across different religious or ethnic lines, longing to still go back. Many of them have these relationships across borders. Many of them were rescued by members of the other community. Those stories are nowhere to be found. So that's just kind of set me off on this journey, and that's what I've been doing. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah. It's fascinating what you've been, and for you, as young as you are, I know you must be hating it, everyone saying about as young as you are, etc. I mean, the age has nothing to do with being your ability or your capacity or your, your maturity. But, those who hadn't been involved, I mean, there's great parts of Pakistan where the partition did not hit them, okay? Like Balochistan or a majority part of Sindh and the Northwest. So how do people who didn't have any connection with India and the partition did not affect them in terms of having to move or change anything, has anyone ever studied what the creation of a nation state called Pakistan meant to most of these people?
That's a brilliant question. I think so much of partition literature is focused on Punjab, and my own work is primarily focused on Punjab, a little bit on Kashmir and now Bangladesh. But recently there have been efforts. There are a lot of young archivists, young people getting involved with oral history work, and we are realizing that there's no one experience of partition, that regional variations matter so much. So there is a little bit, not enough at all, but there is some literature now, there is work being done in some capacity to understand those varied experiences. But one thing that's also happened is that Punjab largely dominates, right? And is very much linked to the nation state project as well. So the textbooks and the narratives at the macro level defined in terms of, the Pakistan state narrative, right? And that, because I do work intergenerationally, so I look at impact on younger children. And I really do fear, and I have experienced that these macro narratives that dehumanize have an impact on how we imagine the other. Mm-hmm. So even though these regions have historically had very different experiences, because a lot of times in the classrooms and because a lot of times through mainstream media and discourse, they're also getting access to these partitioned histories. It is having, it's leaving a lasting impact. So I see children today much more partitioned. And this is in India as well, not just in Pakistan. You see them much more partitioned, much more hostile, much more prejudiced towards each other than their parents may have been. So that there's this tendency to promote a linear narrative, to homogenize experiences, and they're not homogeneous, of course not.
Absolutely.
They vary across gender, caste, religion, region, but at the state level, there's this projection of this one homogeneous narrative, and you're supposed to adhere to it to be a loyal Indian.
What would you recommend to other people to, to teach their children or their family members or friends to unlearn biases, to unlearn their, let's say, to be more aware, to not stereotype, because I feel this is something that is a big challenge for us nowadays, right? We learn certain things, and then how do we unlearn them? I mean, Khushi Appa, maybe there is no recipe. I know there's no recipe that we can give out the world, but from your own experience with your family and friends and, extended community, how would you, help other people to change their perception of, the typical stereotypes?
I think some people will never learn, and they often just buy into that narrative because that's what they feel comfortable with, and they don't like questions being asked. I mean, they don't like questions. I don't know, in our cultures, maybe right from the time we are small. I'm not talking of like certain families or certain people who may have been more privileged and being allowed much more freedom and openness and freedom of thought and reading and questioning. But majority cases, whether it's in the villages or whether it's in the cities, and no matter what, children don't question the elders. Whatever the elders say is the rule, and you don't question. Yeah. No, if you say that I want to do this and they say no, and if you ask why, they'll say, you're too young to know why or what. If I said no, that's no. This is what you have to do, and this is what you have to study. This is what I've told you. This is what is done. And that just now in Bangladesh, there's this huge issue of rapes have become, it's a rampant thing that people have started calling it the rape culture. Now, though most of these rapes have happened in many very remote rural areas or in areas which are extremely conservative, or madrasa girls, students, etc. Still, I hear even now, even today, people talking about, oh, you shouldn't be wearing jeans and Western clothes, that's just inviting. And sorry, haven't you been reading all the papers and seeing that all the rape cases, the majority that have come up, are nothing to do with people who are wearing jeans and T-shirts, etc. So this is something that they've just, we are all questioning now as women's organizations and women and all, in trying to, why should the blame be on the person who's being raped? That victim blaming kind of thing. Her reputation has to be thing. They would try and bring out she had a relationship, an extramarital relationship, etc., etc. Those are totally irrelevant. A crime is a crime. So I think we have a lot of this in our culture, which is you just accept what is told to you and you don't question. And I think what we need to do is raise this issue of questioning much more, trying to decide by yourself and on your own what you think is right and why and how, and understand before accepting. Like even when we work with the people we work with, we form collectives and they form a strong body, which really they've changed in the areas we work in. They've changed a lot of the power dynamics where the poorest are, and women who never used to be part of the, I think in Pakistan, it's called the Jirga. I'm not sure, but this is
Jirga.
We call it
Jirga and
Shalish.
Panchayat. Yeah.
So we called it the Shalish, which is where the leaders of the community sit and decide on what should be done and what punishment should be given or how things should be, compromised or etc. So there we now have our women who are from very poor and landless peasantry coming and being on the committee because they've been able to get to that position. So this is something we are trying to break, is, just learn to accept that changes, learn to not just follow what has been told to you as being, this is the thing. I think we have to start from a young age too. The whole notion of learning to question, learning to find out for yourself, learning to know much more, and learning beyond your own little world. Learn what's happening everywhere, and just don't believe what is being fed to you. And I think that is so important. And that's why creativity, I mean, we're trying to work in our villages, in the world villages we work in, trying to get kids to start being much more creative. And I remember there was sometimes we have young intern students coming in and wanting to spend some time with us, a month or so. So we say, okay, you work with the kids and try and open up their minds, let them know there's a different world and different way of thinking. So you don't have to push your way as being the right way, but just that there are many different. So one asked the little kids, draw yourself 20 years from now. And there was this boy who drew himself as a woman. And so, I mean, that's interesting. That's how he probably felt he was a woman, So trying to then, through that, at some point when we are more comfortable, getting to talk about identities. So, there's so much that needs to be done and so much that has to be done. But I think we start with the beginning instead of thinking we're not going to be able to change the world. Of course, we're not going to be able to change the world. But let's start changing a few people that we can, at least get them to start raising questions. I don't know. Anna, what do you think?
No, I completely agree with you. I think if we are just able to inculcate the sense of asking, being curious, right? Not assuming that you know everything. I think that's a starting point. I think for me, it was also very important to know that I have bias. Each one of us carries certain prejudices and biases, right? And I think that is very critical to know. And I'll share one example with you. When I started doing the work on partition and I was conducting these interviews, and I, finally started to write this book, I went back to some of those interviews and I realized that I had been, as an interviewer, tuning in unconsciously, tuning in and tuning out, right? Depending on what was being said. So for instance, if a partition survivor was speaking about the bloodshed, which kind of mirrored or reinforced what I had read in textbooks and through mainstream, discourse, one-sided violence often, I would tune in because that was what I expected, right? Partition to be. But when somebody would be speaking about, a Muslim would be speaking about Diwali celebrations at Lakshmi Chowk in Lahore, or they would be speaking about having Hindu or Sikh friends, I would listen, but I would think, oh, that is an exception, right? And there was this kind of active tuning out as well. And I had to go and listen back, listen to these audios again, look at these transcripts and realize what I was doing. And realize that, whenever I go into a setting, I'm bringing in my bias. So just being aware of that, knowing that each one of us carries, biases, and nowhere have I fixed them all. There are many blind spots that we all have. I think that's a great starting point. The other thing that I've really seen, because I work as a cultural facilitator as well, the recipe, if you ask, and this is going to sound cliche, but I've seen the impact, is dialogue. Right? I've seen what happens when people come together, and that's why I, just congratulate you. I think this is a fantastic platform, because when we speak to each other, we learn to be curious and we learn to learn about each other through this interaction rather than through social media or through textbooks or through other sources of history. And great transformations can happen. I'll give you two small anecdotes, if that's okay. So one is from, the Skype exchange I had with a school in Mumbai, and I was talking to these children, and about 30-40 minutes in, we were just having an open dialogue. I asked them to, really ask me anything about Pakistan, anything on their minds. And about 30-40 minutes later, this girl got up, 7th grader, and she said, now I know not all Pakistanis are murderers. I can think of going there too. And that for me is the power of dialogue. That for me is the power of just, connection and interaction, people to people interaction with each other. And similarly, when I came to Bangladesh, I went into classrooms over there. I spoke at different public platforms. And I literally had people come up to me and said, can we touch you? Because we have never really imagined or seen a Pakistani beyond the military dictators, right? And the way they're presented. To see a Pakistani in human flesh is something so new for us. Can we touch you? Right? And I'm in touch. with many of them today. And I really do believe that if we can use technology more effectively to do these kind of, bring people together from different settings. If we can ideally work towards, easier visa access in the region. It's so difficult getting across. It's so difficult working across.
You're telling me you can't get visas.
And it took me so long to get to Bangladesh, and I wanted to spend so much more time there doing research, and I couldn't, right? So at the macro level, at the state level, we need policy changes, but till that happens, at a people's level, how do we come together? How do we use technology and other new age mediums to really just speak? Because from my experience, that's all you need sometimes. And sometimes, those conversations are going to be difficult. We have very, very difficult histories we need to negotiate with. We need to come to terms with. That's part of the work. This is not about all hunky-dory stuff, But those conversations need to happen for us to address those parts of our history and how they shape our present.
Mm.
So with your work, the kind of work that you've been doing, Anam, have you managed to change or kind of alter perceptions of people around you? Like, the people around, like you altered mine, and I'm not, friends and family, how they see Bangladesh or how they see partition. Have you been able to see visible changes or nuances in their way of perceiving things?
It's as Khushi was saying, people's perceptions are often very rigid. So there's no magic fix to it. But yes, I do think so, because I've been, one of the very few people in my family who's been able to go across to India. I think maybe the only one who's been to Bangladesh and actually, hearing about people's experiences and bringing them back. So I think that's given people around me, friends, family as well, a different access, a secondary access, but through me, a personal access into the other, right? The so-called other that we perceive and imagine and construct. So I do see, those kind of subtle, it's these questions, having these, we never spoke about 71 growing up, right? We never spoke about Bangladesh. So it's some of the conversations have been extremely charged in my family, very tense conversations because they feel very strongly and I feel very strongly, but at least we're having those conversations. At least we're asking questions. At least we're pushing each other, right? And I think that needs to happen. So we need to make each other uncomfortable sometimes for us to move beyond the silences. So it's tough. There's a lot of work still to be done, but I do think that, just when they hear I went and I came back and I had these experiences, it shifts something. There's a personal access to a people you've never really known. You've been so disconnected from.
Thank you. I have one question about the Khushi, you shared that you're working on a project that also has multiple layers with artists and the development work you've been doing in social work and activism. So is there a project that you're currently working on that you would be excited to share with us that sort of contributes to
Samira, we don't look at anything as a project. For us, everything is a life that just one follows another. I think for those of us who really feel like we need to work, and we are working because I'm passionately part of it. And my people I work with, we're all part of it as passion. And so though I'm with a registered NGO, which receives funds from outside and all that, but we are very clear that we don't look at anything as a project. It's part of the continued work we are doing. But because by now I've been working for so many years and that I get fairly well known, and because I speak out, so there are many other different areas also that I get involved in. Mm-hmm. So apart from art and culture too, and cultural media, we also have within the culture, we have a kind of a dogmatism almost in the cultural scene in Bangladesh. It's a very rigid, controlled, thing of narrative of what you must be projecting, exactly the opposite of what Anam was saying about the narrative in Pakistan. That's the narrative in Bangladesh. I remember when I first started meeting people from Pakistan and had started making really good friends, I had a lot of people saying that I don't want to meet this friend of yours. She's from Pakistan, you know. So because they had been brutalized, but I think people have begun to start breaking out. But even in the cultural field, there's a domination by a certain category of people who are all freedom fighters, and they only want to project a certain kind of what is Bengali culture like. What songs do you sing? What theater work do you do? Art forms. The Dhaka art form is a certain art form, and that's what you do. So that's why I love working with organizations like Britto, because Britto is just breaking all kinds of taboos and norms and getting everybody involved. And it's such an open space, and where they have residency, so they have people coming from outside. They have a lot of workshops with people from outside. So you're exposed to a lot of new kind of ideas. And I think they've brought that in. There's also another group that is trying to change this traditional dance art form into a much more fluid form of looking at what the current social situation is and breaking that. And so I think we're now at a stage when we're looking at everything that we're doing, not from this rigid position, but changing. And there are people who are, trans women, trans men, transgender, and they're beginning to come into our lives and wanting themselves to be heard. They don't want to be boxed into, if you get a job, you only work in an NGO that's working with transgender people. They want to work in mainstream work as professionals and be recognized as being excellent in their work. So I think changing people's mindsets, people who were acid victims, people who were disabilities, how they were all, ignored, and you just have this one thing. So I think we are now in a stage where a lot of changes are happening. Some are negative, some are positive. We want to have our own work with the most remote areas in the rural Bangladesh, with marginalized communities, with those who are the most excluded communities, being part of the mainstream discourse and discussion, and bringing their voices into the center where we bring in policymakers to listen to them. So those are things I don't look at it as a project, but I look at it as something that we have to bring in, and also start talking about how you should bring in, more creative forms into everyone's work, so that it's not that if you're an artist, you're an artist. If you're a dancer, you're a dancer. If you're a theater performer, you're actor, you're an actor. If you're a NGO worker, you're an NGO worker. If you're a political worker, you're a political worker. I mean, I think we have to, if you're a professional, you're a professional. I think we have to learn to talk, merge, learn, expand. That's what I think I feel myself like wanting to do more and more now.
I think we can learn so much from you, Khushi.
Yeah, totally. Is the 1.5 there? I think one of the Bangladeshi organizations, I think it's Britto. Britto. Now that you've said it, it's. Do they have this project? Is it theirs? The 1.5 kilometer radius project.
1 square mile, yeah.
1 square mile. That is so brilliant. When you
the other
community together, it really projects the community and gets the artists into the community. It gives so much. I wanted to literally replicate that project here.
You should.
But because of the situation in Karachi, we couldn't. We really saw that as an excellent way to kind of integrate communities.
The other one they're doing very excellent is No Man's Land. So they have people on the other side of the border in India and here, and the group in India side are working across this. India has done this wire netting, electrified border thing post. And on this side here are the Bangladeshi Britto artists working on the same theme. And then they managed to, because they've been working for a while on both sides of the border, they managed to woo the border forces from both the countries to allow them to at least come and shake hands in the no man's land. So that's what it was, the No Man's Land project, which it was quite amazing.
That is so amazing. I wish we could talk about this more, and I wish the Britto could actually extend this, I think Triangle Arts maybe
The
could,
Triangle Arts
maybe
Center
Triangle
with-
Arts could see this happen in Pakistan also.
I think I'll talk to Britto and they can talk to
We
Triangle.
should
and
actually
we
do
should
this. I
Yeah,
would love to help
I'll
out with
take
this.
And yeah, definitely, Masuma. That would be
Amazing. Yeah.
that would be great. Yeah, I
Just
think that's something-
unbelievable. Okay.
that would be lovely. We could do that. That would really be so interesting to look at all of this. Yeah. Mm.
That's incredible just to see this dialogue potentially creating new collaborations. So that's
Yeah, but I'd like to continue to link up with the both of you because I'm learning so much from both of you, and I've fallen in love with both of you.
it would be my honor.
Same.
I'm so inspired right now.
Samira?
Glad.
So thank you,
I
Samira.
haven't met Samira. And yet I've made such good friends with her. And so I agree with Anam that dialogue is so important to kind of get rid of all these preconceived notions. And I'm loving both of you also. So yeah. And sometimes I wonder, is it only me? Do I just love people so much?
This is just incredible.
How do you reflect on privilege, and what do you think we can do to, sort of include more people? Maybe you have something in your mind that you've been already doing, Yeah, Anna, maybe.
No, I was just going to say, I think Khushi Appa would be able to answer this much better than me, but I'm just wondering if there's a way to take some of these conversations into classrooms and work with, different schools. I know that would be schools which have access to technology. That would be a barrier, and that there's privilege within, that itself. But just, even starting there, and then you can always create other material modules, even graphics that come out of these conversations, which can then maybe be circulated in a wider way. But that's just off the top of my head. Khushi Appa, I think, would have a much better
I think
answer.
that's a wonderful idea. One is that, of course, the language, because we have to, we all speak different languages. If you want to take it out, this is in English. So English it's a privileged group of people who can speak and talk and converse and communicate in English. But if you want to broaden it, it has to be in the language that there has to be some way of trying to, how do we do it? Do we have technology? I find that in a lot of the areas, the kids all have a smartphone. It's not a very good smartphone. And now because of pandemic, all the schools are doing this learning on, on the, they have Zoom classes kind of thing. So the phone is there, and the phone has also been something negatively used because these young boys are videoing rapes and then, using it as a way of extortion and money. And then, I don't know if this is happening in Pakistan, but this is happening in Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. And then this is really, they put it on the internet and it just goes everywhere. And there have been suicides, through this, because how do I show my face? I've had a lot of women come to me, their daughters have had, their daughters' photos photoshopped and then spread. And I've talked to the girl and I said, why do you want to kill yourself for some stupid git like that? An idiot who needs to be put into jail and locked up. But it's not you, and you just learn to hold your head high. And but what it is that technology does exist, and if we can then sort of have somebody who translates into the local language. Mm-hmm. So like if we look at, we're a mainly Bangla speaking country, 99% Bengalis, but 1% are non-Bengal, not Bangla speakers. Many of them are indigenous communities who speak totally different languages. Then we also have the Urdu speaking people who've been living here since ever, for a long time. Since partition, they came, they have grown up here. So you have the Urdu speaking community too. And I think we're beginning to recognize them. Before we would try and say that they are Biharis, Pakistanis, Bihari camp. But now I think we've moved, we've grown. So I think if we have people who can translate, some of us, if we take any of these two different areas and talk about this is what's being done, but it has to be layered and catered to which group of people are we talking to. Like our conversation today would be great amongst a certain age group, not the young kids, absolutely.
Great, absolutely.
So it's, but like anyone can then, who knows English, can just translate it and is sensitive enough on these topics, understand these issues, could translate it into Bangla while it's going on, saying that this is, look how they're talking, how they're sharing, what it is, and it opens up people's minds. I think exchanges are so important. Exchanges are so important. We really need to do that.
Right. I've realized that both of you aren't very active on social media. I am.
I have a Facebook page.
Yeah,
with
I
friends.
do have a page. Yeah, it's not that active.
But it's not a page that's open to the public. It's only to my friends. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So because nowadays, at least the people we've interviewed are very, very social media savvy, the younger lot, and they kind of do their work through social media.
Yeah.
So how do you both manage?
No, there is, I think, and there's a very interesting group which both of you may be interested in. It's called East Pakistan, Bangladesh, 45 to 75. It was 47 to 71. And then some people stayed on and some people came in later. So it's 45 to 75. So most of them, a lot of them are people who are who have moved from Bangladesh to Pakistan in 71 because they were non-Bengalis. And there are Bengalis in this group who have been freedom fighters and very staunch nationalistic kind of freedom fighters. And I've seen this group tried to break all that in bringing back memories of, remember the store, the toast biscuit over here, and remember this food there, and remember this cinema and this song, and then talking about things in a way. And then they've, some of them live abroad. Like when they've lived abroad, they've also had gatherings where they haven't met each other before. But because of this Facebook, and some people they've met after, say, 50 years or so. And it's quite interesting, and that this group has managed, and whenever it gets contentious, then, the group admin is being asked to, stop that discussion because it gets acrimonious sometimes. So stop that for the moment and then go back. So this has been something where people have been, for the first time, being able to vent out in many ways what their feelings were. And I see a lot of, like in India also, those who left East Bengal to go to India have much more feeling of nostalgia about East Bengal than the West Bengalis who've come to East Bengal. Mm-hmm. So those who are in Bangladesh, the people from West Bengal who migrated to Pakistan after 47, don't have as much of a nostalgia feeling, and I don't know why, as those who have gone from here to India and they still have a nostalgia feeling. And the same I see that even I don't have such a nostalgic feeling about Pakistan at all. But those who went from here still have the nostalgia. And I haven't seen, I don't know, Anam would know if anyone studied this or at all, but I haven't seen it. But from whatever I hear from people, and then this Facebook page called Memories of East Pakistan and Bangladesh, I see that those who've left have that nostalgia feeling much more than those who are still here. And I don't know what it is and why it is, but
I'd like to kind of discuss that a little further. So what I've noticed is because my mother came from Gujarat to Pakistan, when you say that people have moved, those people who've moved from east to west don't have that nostalgic feeling. So when you've moved, I realized that when they've moved in acrimonious circumstances, or like in difficult circumstances, they don't want to remember that. They want to block that out, because I asked my mother, like my nani would always want to go back to India or visit sometime, because she had seen the good India, seen the good Gujarat. But my mother, she said, no, I don't want to go back to Gujarat. The school girls would circle around us and say, "Tame tamara Pakistan hala jao," and that would be very traumatic for us because we were Indian, so for her it was difficult. Similarly, for my chacha, um, who used to live in Dhanmandi in Dhaka, he when he came to Pakistan, we never asked him really what happened. Uh, this is after reading Anam's book that I wanted to ask. He's living in Canada, but he's lost his memory. And so I asked my chachi, and I'm getting narratives from her. But it is very difficult for her to kind of recall that kind of thing. Although she loves Bangladesh and she still talks like a Bangladeshi, like she doesn't talk like a Pakistani. Like she'll say, Dada, Dada ye bolta tha, fir Dada ne ye bola, fir hum idhar gaya, fir hum, her Urdu is also very Bangladeshi. But also a Jewish friend of mine who left Pakistan and went to Tel Aviv. And when I asked her that, can your mother tell me what happened, because you just got married and you left, but your mother would know. So she said, my mother doesn't want to come back and she doesn't want to talk about Pakistan because it hurts her so much. And yet they talk in Urdu. They, as a family, they wear only the Pakistani dress because they're Pakistanis for them. So if you live in circumstances that are not good, I guess that memory just erases itself out. You don't want to go there. You don't want to visit that memory.
yeah,
Maybe.
Anyway, I would really love to keep in touch. And Anam, I want to read your books.
I would
Are they
love for you to-
available?
The 71 one is available in Bangladesh, yes.
Yeah. Who published in Bangladesh also?
No, it's been published by Penguin Random House in
Yeah.
India. So it actually hasn't made its way to Pakistan because of India-Pakistan relations right now, but it has come to Bangladesh. So there is
Okay,
that.
so it'll be available if I just look at it and.
It should be, yes. I've heard it's being circulated there. Yeah.
Okay, great. And the Kashmir one, you haven't.
A Kashmir one, which I don't know if it's available in Bangladesh, but otherwise it's available on Amazon. It's in India. It's in Pakistan as well.
Yeah, for here, Kashmir is not so much an issue. I have families, like my father, my father had two sisters and there were 6 brothers. And of the 6 brothers, 2 were in India and both were ministers in India. And 3 were in Bangladesh. One was married a Saudi lady in the 1920s and stayed in Saudi Arabia, but their children went to school in Pakistan, so they're Pakistanis. So I have first cousins in all 3 countries.
Oh, wow.
Amazing.
So my chacha's children are in all 3 countries, and we're in touch with each other, and the ones who have become Pakistanis have not come here. But, again, social networking is good. But the ones with India, we have very close relations with, or used to. But I found now that my Indian cousins, who were so Indian, and because they've been in the highest of positions in many places, have suddenly realized they are Muslims.
Ah,
And they feel second class. This is after having moved from East Bangladesh, from a place that became Pakistan, leaving their home for a secular state, and now feeling totally threatened. We can go on for hours, but thank you so much.
Thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just loved all of you. I loved being here today.